Good morning. Welcome to our regularly scheduled audit committee meeting for Monday, June 11th, 2018. My name is Lene Palmisano and I chair this committee. With me here on the dais are Park Commissioner Chris Meyer, Citizen Member David Fisher, Citizen Member Scott Neal, and Council Member Jeremy Schrader. Please let the record reflect that we have a quorum and we are authorized to do the city's business. Before you is a proposed agenda today. First on this agenda is the adoption of the agenda for people that are new. And does anyone have any questions or need to add anything to today's agenda? With that, I'll move this agenda forward. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. The second item is to accept the minutes of April 9th, 2018. That was our last scheduled meeting. May I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Thank you. Second? Moved by Commissioner Neal, moved by Member Neal, seconded by Member Fisher. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. The first item of new business before us today is the appointment of the Director of Internal Audit. Let me give you a little bit of background. It is fundamental to the success of this department to fill this role with an individual who understands the city, the enterprise, its goals, and its personalities that exist within it. Therefore, it's been up to this committee to recruit a leader capable of developing and implementing an enterprise-wide vision, combined with a collaborative approach, in addition to the requisite audit experience. Here to present a brief report about the hiring process that we've been conducting since January of this year is Mr. John Frood from Council staff. Mr. Frood.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is John Frood, and I'm the Senior Policy Aide to the 13th Ward Council Office. At the Chair's request, I'm here to give a brief summary of the designed hiring process for the Director of Internal Audit. Back in February, a job announcement was posted both internally on the city's job board and externally on industry websites detailing the qualifications for a new director. The Human Resources Department processed applications and forwarded a group that met the minimum qualifications to the hiring team. Chair Palmisano, along with Citizen Committee members Scott Neal and David Fisher, along with formal Director of Internal Audit Will Tetzel, selected candidates to participate in additional interviews. This provided an opportunity to better get to know the candidates and help them understand the audit committee and the audit process within the city. We conducted phone interviews based on technical expertise. We interviewed candidates in person. We brought in candidates from out of state. We also brought in additional candidates to bolster the talent pool along the way. During those interviews, candidates met with Chair Palmisano, Mayor Jacob Fry, Citizen Committee Member David Fisher, Council Member Abdi Orsame, City Clerk Casey Carl, City Attorney Susan Siegel, City Coordinator Nuria Rivera Vandermeide, the city's Chief Financial Officer Mark Ruff, Chief Human Resources Officer Patience Ferguson, Senior Strategic Policy Advisor to the Mayor Peter Ebnett, and Internal Audit Manager Kirill Vasilyev. Leadership assessments were administered for final candidates by John Fennig from DRI Consulting, who analyzes candidates and compares them to other members of the city's executive team, as well as other industry leaders. It was during this lengthy process that one candidate rose to the top, and through which Ms. Ginger Bigby comes before you today. Before I conclude my remarks, I do want to again thank Rebecca Hardell from Human Resources for her input, advice, and flexibility through this process. That concludes my prepared comments. I'm happy to stand for any questions.
Are there any questions or comments before this committee before we vote? Mr. Neal, do you have any? Oh. Great. The motion is on the appointment of Ginger Bigby to the position of Director of Internal Audit. I want to thank both Ginger Bigby for being here this morning, the team that's before you, Huguette, Ethan, Travis, and Kirill, and Rebecca Hardell from Human Resources is here as well, who's been instrumental in this process. All those in favor of appointing Ginger Bigby to be our city's next Internal Audit Director, please say aye. 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 Opposed? The ayes have it. Ms. Bigby, you're appointed to the position of Director of Internal Audit for the City of Minneapolis. Congratulations. Next on the agenda is the administrative motion that is to authorize the chair of this committee, that's myself, to execute documents necessary that finalize her hire All those in favor of this motion, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it, and I have been authorized to finalize this hire. Before I conclude, I want to invite Ms. Bigby to address the committee if she so wishes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. Thank you, Audit Committee members, for this opportunity to serve as the city's internal auditor. I'm very excited to get started in a few weeks as I wind down my current responsibilities. A couple of the first things that I'd like to address are looking at the department policies and procedures, our department's policies and procedures, to see where we can enhance and strengthen our processes, perhaps introduce a quality assurance and improvement program. And most importantly, look at the city's risk environment. Make sure we understand the control environment that surrounds all of the city's activities and services so that we can have a flexible audit plan for 2019 and going forward, and really focus our efforts on the areas that are most needed to ensure that the city council and the mayor can achieve their goals and objectives. Also, I'd like a better understanding of the open audit issues that we have right now, what risk exposure lies around those open audit issues. So while the departments and the internal audit department are working hard to shore up those gaps, make sure that we know which ones pose the highest risk to the city so that at any given time, we have a clear understanding of our risk exposure. And it's a pleasure to be here. I really thank you for this opportunity. May I also say that I'd like to thank my current supervisor and colleagues for all of their encouragement and support as I move to public service.
Thank you. And your first day in our office, I think, will be July 9th formally?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Terrific. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Great. So next we have the Meet Minneapolis audit. Here to present that audit is Mr. Kirill Vasiliev. I also want to point out that we have here in the audience Jeff Johnson, Melvin Tennant, and Courtney Reese from the Convention Center. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Please give me a moment while we experience technical difficulties with getting the presentation up. Madam Chair, committee members, my name is Kirill Vasiliev, and I'm the manager for the Internal Audit Department. Today we're going to be starting with the presentation of the Meet Minneapolis audit and then looking at the following two agenda items. For Meet Minneapolis, this audit was conducted as part of the 2017 audit plan. It was a lengthy process in part due to our commitment unexpectedly to do the body camera presentation and audit, and also to deal with some staffing changes, which is why it has taken significantly longer than expected. And I appreciate the patience of Meet Minneapolis and the Convention Center staff with the lengthy process. The background for this project, the audit covered a contract that the city has with Meet Minneapolis. The goals of this contract are to have Meet Minneapolis promote the city and the Convention Center and city's hospitality assets. The contract is under oversight and direction of the Convention Center Executive Director, Jeff Johnson, and City Coordinator. Meet Minneapolis is the booker for the Convention Center events and is our primary destination marketing organization. So they're very important for having our Convention Center be booked with great events that bring people outside of the state and outside of the country to Minneapolis to see the city. The performance of Meet Minneapolis under this contract is measured through several performance indicators that are specified in the contract, including 4 key performance indicators, which are also tied to annual incentive funding if Meet Minneapolis achieves predetermined goals. As part of this oversight, the contract includes specific provisions where information is periodically shared with the city through quarterly and year-end reports, through budget reports, and through sales and marketing plans. And of course, in addition to these formal channels, there's additional communications between Meet Minneapolis and the city as needed. The objectives of this audit were to look at how our city is monitoring and controlling the contract to make sure that Meet Minneapolis is complying with its provisions, to look at certain provisions of the contract and determine whether Meet Minneapolis is complying with them, and to review the accuracy of reports that Meet Minneapolis provides to the city to ensure that we are getting complete and accurate information when we do get it. The scope of the audit was from January 1st, 2015 through February 26th of 2011. So we covered all of 15, 16. Due to the timing of the audit, we also covered part of 2017 to the extent that we looked for continuation of certain issues that we'd otherwise noted. So February 26th is that date of the 2017 year-end report. And our approach for this audit focused very heavily on interviews with various staff and requesting and reviewing supporting documentation for the various reports and supporting documentation to show compliance with contract provisions.
Just to interject, as you changed the slide, I believe you meant 2015 to 2018 as it says on your slide. You'd said 2011. That's fine.
Oh, thank you. Our audit resulted in 4 findings and 1 area of improvement. The first finding groups observations about a number of different performance indicators that are presented in the quarterly and annual reports. So there's first finding, it has 7 components. The second finding has observations about Meet Minneapolis conflict of interest policy. The third finding looks at some contract required reporting elements that did not appear in the written reports that the city received. The fourth finding comments on our oversight of the contract. And then there was an area of improvement for record retention observation. So the 7 components of the first finding, finding 1.1, one of the performance indicators is the economic impact performance indicator. It is an estimate of how much direct financial impact events that Meet Minneapolis has scheduled have brought to the Twin Cities metro area. This metric is developed using an industry standard tool that Meet Minneapolis inputs event result data into and spits out a dollar figure that gets aggregated for all events over the course of the year and presented in the reports. We observed 2 issues here. The first issue was the way certain events were tracked in Meet Minneapolis's tracking system resulted in double counting. So an event that had overflow rooms that were identified after the initial booking would need to get a new event type created so that hotels could be found. But unless the individuals creating those extra events updated all the data, a lot of the initial event data would just auto-populate down, and that would result in a overflow booking for 100 rooms to have the same attendance as the original event of 10,000 rooms, effectively significantly overstating the impact of certain events by double counting them. There's another similar issue where individual contracts for a series of events would get entered in once and then duplicated for every quarterly or monthly meeting, also counting certain impacts 4 times or 12 times. We observed this issue in our sample, and then we reviewed the total data set to estimate the economic impact adjustment and saw that in 2015, we estimate an overstatement of 120 million versus the 430 million impact reported, an impact of 25 million in 2016 versus the 460 million reported, and an impact of 50 million overstatement in 2017 versus the $660 million impact reported. So the double counting did have a measurable impact on the reported numbers. The secondary issue is the figures used to estimate the impact were based on pre-event attendance. For certain events, the Minneapolis Convention Center does a head count of the actual attendees, and that results in a more accurate estimate of attendance than you would have 2 or 3 months prior to the event. That meant that when calculating economic impact, in some cases, much more accurate event attendance data was available but was not used. The overall impact was fairly minor because some events were underestimated and some were overestimated, but individual event swings could be very high. And considering that the better estimate data was readily available, it seems like an easy opportunity to reduce the risk of misstatement by using the most up-to-date attendance figures. And I do want to say one more thing here, and that is this isn't one of the key performance indicators, so this is not one of the 4 measures that were determined by the city and Minneapolis to be the most important, but it is probably one of the more visible figures and the most commonly discussed figures for destination marketing organizations. So making sure that we have accurate, clear reporting on here is fairly important. Any questions about 1.1 before I move on?
Any questions from my colleagues? Nope. Continue.
The second issue identified was with the private revenue key performance indicator. We did not see any issues with the calculation methodology, but we, when discussing this indicator, noted that the goal of including this as an indicator was not to just measure how much private revenue was raised, but to measure how well Meet Minneapolis leveraged city-provided funds, with the idea of the city pays in $1 rather than taking that and hosting an event, we turn it into more than $1. Because the private revenue indicator in the report, in the contract, was just a pure how much was raised, it didn't really present a clear picture of how effective Meet Minneapolis was at leveraging that initial investment to produce additional funds. While there's a more complicated discussion here of even if we break even on an event, we might be hosting something that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to do without this corporate partner. If we're talking about leveraging the city's investment, we would recommend an additional performance indicator or additional component to this indicator to really discuss not just how much was raised, but how much time and money and effort went into raising that additional revenues from the private sector. Finding 1.3 is on the future leisure room nights key performance indicator. This is a key performance indicator, so it's tied to incentive funding at the end of the year. The contract required that a third-party audit confirming these figures be conducted, and this was not something that was being done. We recommend that either a third-party audit be conducted or the contract be tweaked to not require that element. Adjusting the contract might be reasonable because a lot of these figures come in from a third party anyway. They come in from event planners or hotels that state how much leisure room nights were booked as a result of Meet Minneapolis' activities. So there's already some third-party assurance there. So it's more of a contract compliance issue with one of these key indicators that's tied to incentive funding that we observed not being followed. Finding 1.4 is the Convention Center's attendance performance indicator. Meet Minneapolis receives data from the Convention Center to state how many individuals attended the Convention Center during a given period. We observed that there was a significant revision in some of the Convention Center numbers after it provided them to Meet Minneapolis, and that this revision wasn't communicated to Meet Minneapolis until we started requesting information for the audit. So we're seeing numbers that are inaccurate, not through Meet Minneapolis' fault, but through their source, and just a non-communication of the end result and of the issue noted. As part of this, we also didn't see any specific measures saying at what point a revision should trigger a restatement of a prior quarterly report. So our recommendations here are to put in place some sort of process whereby if the Convention Center revises figures that Meet Minneapolis relies on, there should be a set of process to communicate those revisions. And there should be a set expectation of if the performance measure reported needs to be adjusted by some amount that causes a reissuance of a report, whether that be 5%, 10%, 2%. There needs to be some sort of expectation under which a revision gets issued. The next two findings are similarly related. One's engaged digital users indicator, and the other is visitor request for information indicator. In both of these cases, we observed that there was a change to how a measure was being calculated that significantly changed the number that was reported. The goals being set for Meet Minneapolis did seem to take these into account. The issue we took was the disclosure of the change in methodology. There wasn't anything other than the verbal communications between Meet Minneapolis and the city for most of these changes, and the actual quarterly reports didn't state, we've changed how this is being presented, and they didn't provide a comparable adjustment to prior figures to really be able to have a user of that report understand why there's a change and how much of a change it is, and to be able to compare year to year. And our final observations on the performance indicators was the way the return on investment performance indicator was developed. The return on investment indicator is dependent on how much economic impact there was divided by the organization's operating budget. It's a pretty straightforward calculation. However, the operating budget was established and the economic impact goal was established independently of this return on investment indicator, which meant that to achieve the return on investment goal that was set before them, Meet Minneapolis would have had to either way overperform their economic impact goal or way underspend their budget, because while they're interrelated, they were considered separately. So the way this goal has been established was essentially either setting up Meet Minneapolis to fail or requiring them to overperform in some other way. And that seemed incongruent. Our second finding for this report is on the conflict of interest policy. Meet Minneapolis has a conflict of interest policy, which is reviewed by their board. This policy includes a gift limit of $50, beyond which a clear conflict of interest would be expected, and it required annual conflict of interest disclosures from board members, officers, and employees. Minneapolis didn't fully implement these policies. They collected annual conflict of interest disclosures from the board members, but relied on information provided by employees at new hire orientation, and relied on these employees to self-disclose any changes rather than collecting the required annual disclosures. The other incongruence was the employee handbook had a higher gift limit of $100, beyond which conflict of interest would be expected from certain parties, versus the lower $50 limit of the conflict of interest policy. And the additional comments I'd have here is there's not necessarily the idea that $100 or $50 is appropriate. And of course, an annual conflict of interest disclosure is only as good as the person willing to disclose the information. But this speaks to corporate compliance culture and communicating that and having employees and officers be aware that somebody is paying attention to these kinds of issues and that they are important for the corporation.
Mr. Vasiliev, we have a question from Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal.
Mr. Vasiliev, for those of us that work in city government or in state government, local government in general, $50 and $100 gift limits are quite a bit different than what we're used to. Is there a statutory gift limit for Meet Minneapolis that they need to comply with, to the best of your knowledge?
Madam Chair, Mr. Neal, I am not aware of one. I do know that, for example, the executive director of the convention center is a board member, but is held to the city's gift limit policy rather than the Minneapolis one. But I don't know if there's a specific limit. I do know that Minneapolis is a separate organization, even though it's primarily funded by the city. And I don't know what it would be required to fall under.
Okay.
That might be a question for our city attorney's office.
Okay.
So just to reiterate what you just said, because there are city council members that sit on this board, what you're saying is that the city council members are held to the city's gift policy and limits above, and they go well above and beyond the conflict of interest policy of Meet Minneapolis, correct?
That is my expectation, and I would expect that if a city council member accepted a gift of $50 because the Meet Minneapolis policy allowed them to, that could still potentially violate a city conflict of interest policy and wouldn't excuse that violation.
Thank you. Ms. Trammell, I'm just curious if you wanted to interject here any state statutorial or any other information about this policy.
Chair Palmisano, members of the Audit Committee, the policy at the city is referred to the gift ban, the state gift ban as well, and that is much more limited than the policy that's been adopted here by Meet Minneapolis. The conflict of interest policy through the city ordinances is not connected to the gift ban. So they're two separate things, and they seem to have a conflict of interest policy that incorporates a gift prohibition. That being said, I'd have to review Meet Minneapolis's contract, but generally contracts have within them, when the city issues a contract, a clause that requires the contractor to abide by the terms of the city's ethics code. So there would be an argument made that Meet Minneapolis, to the extent that it's being funded, if it were being funded entirely by city dollars, that the city's gift ban would apply. If it's not being funded entirely by city dollars, it gets a little more complicated than that. And many of our other vendors have gift policies that are different than the city policies. But for most definitely, all of the city employees and the elected officials who serve on the Meet Minneapolis board would need to abide by the city's gift ban as set forth in Ordinance 15.50.
Thank you. Any other questions from colleagues? Nope. Carry on.
Thank you. The third finding in the report was related to contract required reporting. The contract with Meet Minneapolis lists certain elements that are to be included with quarterly reports, with year-end reports, and with budget plans. We didn't observe some of these elements when we were provided copies of these plans and these reports. Specifically, the budget plan per contract is to include narratives addressing outcomes provided by various funding sources. The budget plans we received didn't have narratives. The contract also lists that quarterly reports are to include narratives of prior quarter activities and initiatives, highlighting successes and challenges. We did see a few narratives, but they seemed to talk about very specific initiatives and did not provide a summary of quarterly activities, highlighting successes and challenges. And finally, the year-end report is to include documentation needed to explain material deviations from the approved budget plan and sales and marketing plan. The copies of quarterly reports we received, or year-end reports, received, didn't have supporting documentation. Based on our discussions, these elements were provided verbally, other than supporting documentation, which is difficult to provide verbally. And when we communicated with our city staff, they seemed knowledgeable and aware of everything that was going on. We don't believe that there's anything not being communicated, but the contract requirements do require narratives to be a part of these reports, and we didn't see these components in the reporting. The fourth finding relates to City of Minneapolis's contract oversight, and specifically with the key performance indicators, which are tied to incentive funding. The contract requires that the city review supporting documentation for the completion of these indicators, for the accuracy and applicability of that documentation. When we request supporting documentation, we were informed that this process is done verbally. So aside from the annual report provided that lists the performance indicators and their achievement, the city was not doing documentation review and was not reviewing the documentation for accuracy and applicability. Again, based on our discussion with city staff, they seemed well informed as to what was going on. We don't believe that there's any obfuscation of any information. However, the contract does require our city staff to obtain supporting documentation and review it for accuracy and applicability. I do also want to note that as a corrective action, after we initially discussed this area, but before the report was even drafted, the Convention Center staff did request additional documentation for the 2017 year-end results, which took the form of a requiring Meet Minneapolis to conduct agreed-upon procedures with a third-party auditor. So I think there's definitely actions already taken to address some or all of this issue.
So I just want to point out here, as you change the slide to go on, that while it says on the slide that Meet Minneapolis agrees with the finding, there has been some more back and forth here that Carol's mentioning about how they've proactively worked to remediate or to take some action already. So that's good. Go ahead.
Madam Chair, that is correct. And even considering the actions taken, that still doesn't change the actions for prior years. The final area to discuss here is record retention. During fieldwork, a portion of the documents we requested were unavailable because Meet Minneapolis changed a vendor and did not retain the original documentation for the contract required 6 years. This was initially listed as a finding. However, as part of the draft response process, Meet Minneapolis was able to contact the vendor and get a commitment to obtain this documentation that was not available to us during the course of our review, because that was a foundation of this issue, was Meet Minneapolis not having access to these records for the requisite time period. Because that was addressed, it didn't seem appropriate to continue holding that finding. However, we did still recommend that there be an internal review of how record retention is managed, especially with vendor changes, to ensure that this doesn't happen again. I have a final slide here to discuss follow-up. This was a third-party audit, so our purview is limited to whether or not Meet Minneapolis is complying with the contract provisions. As a result, the focus of our follow-up will be to work with the convention center to determine whether or not these issues are being addressed. If the convention center deems that it is appropriate for us to communicate with Meet Minneapolis directly on an issue, we would do that, but our expectation will be to work primarily with the convention center rather than Meet Minneapolis to resolve the identified issues. I also do want to note that the current contract with Meet Minneapolis is up for renewal, I believe, in 2020. So for some issues where the appropriate resolution might be adjusting the terms of the contract, it is likely that makes more sense to do as part of a 2020 contract revision rather than trying to put together an amendment now, which will be getting reworked in several months anyway.
Thank you. Questions from my colleagues? I did have some questions that I think we covered in agenda setting. I can't remember them right now. So I appreciate this audit. I think that those here present also appreciate this audit and a thorough look as to how we can work better with our convention center. Anything else from anybody? Okay. Oh, Mr. Fisher.
Oh, thank you. I don't sit up here enough. My reading of the report is that Meet Minneapolis has agreed with all the findings that you've made and are acting on them as we speak, and that there's nothing particularly significant in the findings I found that were troubling. It seems like it's cleaning up a little bit rather than actually finding anything of significance. So would that be an accurate statement?
Madam Chair, Mr. Fisher, I do want to note that the response was a joint response from the Minneapolis Convention Center and Meet Minneapolis. So it wasn't just Meet Minneapolis providing a response, but also the Convention Center. I think that's important to note because they are an integral part of the contract oversight process. And I think that your statement is very accurate. The issues are more cleanup and adjustment and making sure that if we're putting something in the contract, we make sure it happens, or we don't put it in the contract in the first place. If it's in there, if it's important enough to have been in the contract, we should make sure that we're enforcing those provisions. There's also somewhat of a learning experience with this contract specifically. This was the first one with Meet Minneapolis where specific performance indicators and numerical goals were even set up and established. I think from prior conversations, it might be one of the first types of contracts like this for a destination marketing organization anywhere. So that's part of a learning process of figuring out how do we actually measure this? Is this a good number or not? How do we approach the methodology that maybe if we document in the contract and then realize it's wrong, we can't now change it without amending the contract? Maybe there's different approaches to having those goal setting processes that are better documented. So I think with any contract revision in 2020, we can do it much more intelligently and hopefully put in things that are important that we track, enforce, and have documents that we can review later and audit for.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Mr. Vasiliev, I do want to note that on page 7 of your report, and you mentioned this, it does talk about the estimated overstatement of economic impact over these 3 years as being over $200 million. I think that's significant. But you also mentioned that this is a figure that is used in industry and less important to the actual kind of day-to-day work or work between the city and the convention center. Can you tell me what you think this kind of overstatement means, or can you tell me anything more about the kind of decisions we make based on a reported impact that was overstated?
Madam Chair, so this number is a common measure of what the effectiveness of marketing is, because it's really hard to figure that out. You hold an event and you spend 100 hours planning it, and you host it, and maybe you can get rent and some other items, but the real impact to the city is not just that event. It's also people coming in and staying in hotel rooms, eating food, doing tours. So that's what this indicator is supposed to measure. There's this indicator, which is direct economic impact, but there's also a larger, broader indicator, which is also commonly used and feels less reliable, which is overall economic impact, not just direct. So that would be measuring, well, if it weren't for this person staying in this hotel, the hotel staff wouldn't have jobs and wouldn't have money, and cascades down to several levels. So we're not measuring that, which is even harder to try and get your arms around. And the city, in developing this contract with Minneapolis, elected not to use this as one of the key performance indicators, I think in part because it's an estimate. And without going to an event and interviewing everyone and finding out where they stayed and where they went to eat and are they from out of town or in town, it's really hard to get an actual measure, which makes it less of a useful measure to determine incentive funding. That the impact overstatement is $200 million almost. The number isn't necessarily, the number is large, which makes it more impactful, but it's not the specific number. It's that the reporting was inaccurate and miscounted certain events in a systemic way over the course of several years. So it's more of a changing that methodology or adding in an additional control process to review these figures before they're put into a report. That's really important. One more thought on the usefulness of this indicator. While we're not necessarily using it to decide whether or not there's additional incentive funding for Meet Minneapolis, that doesn't mean that a future contract wouldn't decide this is more important. And I'd also like to note, for one other contract, an estimated economic impact was used as part of discussing the Target Center arena renovations. And an economic impact analysis study over the course of the life of the renovation showed that it would bring in enough money that it was worth for the city to invest tens of millions of dollars into a renovation. So while here it might not be the most valuable thing in its current form, it has been used in other places to support significant investments as being economically viable. So accurate reporting, while not being used right now, could be being used at a later point in time to justify significant expenditures.
Yep, that's my concern. Super. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. With that, I'd like to move to receive and file this Meet Minneapolis audit report and direct staff to publish the report. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Thank you for being here this morning, Mr. Tennant, Mr. Johnson, Ms. Reese. We appreciate your forthcomingness and your willingness to engage with our audit committee. Next, we have our regular audit plan update, and with us here to present today, one more time, is Mr. Vasiliev.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So while this is our regular update, we're doing it in a more specifically called out way. The annual audit plan is established every year and approved by the audit committee. It can be amended with approval of the audit committee, which, whenever there's been changes to the plan, have been incorporated in auditor updates, but it seemed appropriate to specifically call it out to the same level that the initial plan was, so that there is clear communication of these are the amendments to the 2018 audit plan, and to clearly receive an approval from the audit committee as to changing that plan. So with some of these changes, they were discussed at the prior audit committee in April. Some of these changes are new. So here presented are there's going to be 3 slides with the 2018 audit plan as presented originally, and with edits showing clearly what the amendments are going to be. This slide has the audits that were planned for 2018. In particular, the audits for record retention are being reduced in scope because, as we were working to coordinate with the clerk's records staff, we figured out they're doing a significantly larger body of work than we initially expected and understood them to be doing. And because there are a lot of records, and doing a focused review as we were initially planning did not seem appropriate to really affect the approach to records for the department. It might identify specific issues, but we don't have time to go to everyone's office. And for the important result here, which is being ready to move into a completely new office building, everyone needs to have their records clean. So it's going to be more of a department level processes approach, and making sure that the department has the authority and the process to take those recommendations from clerk record staff, which are really the experts here, and to implement them so that when they are relocating to the new building in 2020, we're not scrambling and shoving things into expensive, far away long-term storage that we need every day. And I did expand this to overlap public works as well, because it's the same idea and the same type of project. And as soon as we have a clear idea of how CPED is functioning, we will be starting up a very similar process for the public works department, at least for those components that are relocating to the new building. The other item that was presented last time, but is here called out more clearly, is an audit of the contract with AEG. And the objectives will be to, very similarly to Meet Minneapolis, look at how well AEG is complying with specific provisions of its contract, look at the accuracy of reporting, and look at how well the city's oversight for this contract is functioning. This lists our planned consultation projects for the year. The change that is highlighted here for this committee meeting is where we've been able to identify a more specific affordable housing project than do something with affordable housing, which is kind of where we started the year with. I'm not sure it fully covers the planned scope, and we may be able to identify an additional review area, but in the interim, we're developing a project that will be looking at how inspections and inspection results overlap with affordable housing data and potentially inform whether we need to be targeting certain inspections in certain specific ways. We think this is a very valuable project. We have access to part of the data. We're just trying to figure out what all is even available and how we are able to combine it before it can really speak to more specifics as to what the potential conclusions can be. The final item that is being added today is in response to a request from Chief Ohado of the Minneapolis Park Board. Several months ago, he reached out to us saying that the Park Board is rolling out body-worn cameras for its police officers and requested that we review that rollout process, look at their policies, procedures, and look at their compliance with the state statute. We're not looking at it, we're not conducting a biennial compliance audit for that statute, but we are going to look at what has been put in place and use our knowledge that we have gleaned from working with the city's police department to hopefully identify some potential areas of improvement for the park board before they have to comply with that biennial state audit statute in about a year and a half. And this slide has the audit work that is being conducted by our co-sourced IT auditors. We noted last time that the police records management system, based on the state it is in and how far along implementation was, rather than consulting on developing appropriate security policies and procedures and controls during implementation, because they are so far along, we are waiting a short period of time until the implementation is actually done so that we can review how well it went and the current configurations. And because we're reviewing something that is already in place rather than assisting with developing something for later, it is much more appropriate to conduct an audit with actionable follow-up recommendations rather than a consultation with suggestions. And also, as presented previously, the third-party risk management process consultation has been put on hold because there's not been a completed project for us to look at to see whether or not IT's implemented their new process. And until they've got that, there's not really anything to do for that project. So this is a summary of the modifications that I'd gone through for the 2018 audit plan. And I'm happy to answer any questions or listen to comments.
Thank you. One clarification, Mr. Vasiliev. On the consult with MPRB and their body-worn camera program, is it just about compliance with state statute, or does it also involve some of their policies and procedures and how that might be more consistent with Minneapolis Police Department's evolving policies and procedures?
Madam Chair, state statute, at least in part, talks about what has to be in your policies and procedures. So we are definitely reviewing what those are for those elements. Because we're looking at it and because we'll be using the current MPD policy as a reference, since we have gone through it very carefully recently and made sure that it was fully compliant, we'll be able to identify potentially other areas where there might be incongruencies. I think the park board current policy is heavily based on the prior MPD policy. So maybe highlighting why some of the changes occurred to the policy and areas for consideration will definitely be on the table. And as we meet with Chief Ohado and talk about any specific concerns he might have, we can see if we can address those within the planned scope of the review here.
Thank you. Any other questions from my colleagues? I don't. Please, Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Vasiliev, you reported that the IT third-party risk management process is on hold, but are they putting in place? Are they working to put in place the risk management process that you would be examining?
Madam Chair, Mr. Fisher, They have developed policies and procedures and put them in place. However, the policies and procedures are, here's how we will approach a third-party contract from risk management's perspective. And while things are in place, the goal here is to verify it is actually happening and advise where maybe what's been put in place could be improved. And that's what we're waiting for. So everything has been established, but there's nothing to execute that new process on. So we don't necessarily know if it works until they're trying to use it.
Thank you. I also want to point out that last time we did the IT audit that involved the business impact analysis for disaster recovery purposes. And from this committee, we did forward on to another committee, to Mr. Warsami's, Councilmember Warsami's Ways and Means Committee. And we did do a staff direction from council that asked them to put out an RFP in fairly short order for that business impact analysis. So that is moving forward and has moved beyond this committee from prior work that we did this year with IT. So thank you for this. I'm going to make a motion to approve this amended Internal Audit Department Annual Audit Plan. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. I also, are you completed with this update? Is that, there you go. I will, you have this presentation upcoming. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. So with that, we will continue on to the auditor's update. Mr. Vasiliev.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Auditor update, a brief summary of the audit plan in progress, comments on prior findings, and a couple of items for department level information. So with the audit plan progress, this hasn't been updated for the just approved amendments, but will be next time. But for the audits, we have completed the third-party audit of Meet Minneapolis and Diversion Solutions for the year, which were carryovers from last year. We're in the middle of fieldwork for payroll and are waiting for a few more final request items before we can start wrapping that up. We've completed our planning for the most part for the contract audit of AEG and for the records retention process for CPED, and are planning to start them up now that Meet Minneapolis is wrapped up. The other two items on here are going to be happening once we've completed some of these other areas and are able to focus on additional projects. For the consultations, we have identified that review area as mentioned before. I think I do want to note that for fleet services, there's been some delay in communicating with them because they were focusing a lot on establishing their budget for 2019, and that has taken a lot of their attention. And while we were initially going to work with them prior to their budget submission, we are now starting to work with them now that their budget submission has occurred. And for the NCR process review, we do have 3 points of feedback that we've defined with NCR for the consult and have completed one of them and are targeting the next point of feedback later in the summer, early fall, and a final point of feedback with a resulting final report by end of the year as to our work. And for the business continuity disaster recovery, we're doing essentially a survey with gathering specific information on current systems that departments know about, so that can be a reference point both for any business continuity work that IT is doing with their consultant, and also to inform our emergency management office, which is conducting a citywide disaster recovery plan that doesn't focus on IT, but I believe they're planning to look at including certain IT elements. And then for the IT work in progress, we did not have a completed IT audit to present for this meeting, but the consultants do believe that both of the access and critical content systems, continuity and access for the critical traffic control and Minneapolis water systems should be available for the August committee meeting. So their review is progressing well, and Public Works has been communicative about providing information for that. State auditor findings. In response to a staff direction from this committee, we check in with individuals responsible for addressing state auditors' findings and provide information as to whether or not they are completed to this committee. We are still in progress on the federal award program procurement policies and procedures for the city. Our city's internal controls manager is coordinating with the state auditor to make sure that we resolve these in a way that fixes it and is acceptable to the external auditors. And the federal grants cash management reporting requirements are also still in progress at the Minneapolis Park Board. For our internal findings follow-up, continue with the same format presentation as last time. We have the various projects, how many findings or recommendations were originally noted in the report, how many action steps management stated they are going to take to resolve those issues. The middle column here represents where we were effectively at the beginning of this year at the first audit committee meeting, and where we are now, along with target completion dates. We haven't done that much in terms of updating this from the prior committee meeting, but we have on the back end been able to go through and significantly progress how many of the completed items we were able to review and say, yes, they are complete. The same exact information for the audits that had specific Minneapolis Park Board components. Again, the HR file maintenance retention audit, the Park Board has completed their action item steps, and that area is closed. And with the Park and Recreation Worker Safety audit, there's still a fair number of action steps that are in progress, but the critical ones that caused the longest time delay, which involved hiring of a health and safety consultant, was completed, and they have a number of milestones in June and July that hopefully they'll be able to meet, and that we'll definitely be reporting on next time. And then finally, staffing initiatives. We have our summer and fall interns hired and selected. Travis Cam has started a week ago, and we have another intern starting mid-August for just the fall period. Also, the thing that had been on here before but is no longer on here is a vacant director position, which has been filled, which is good news and will help us get a lot of our work progressing faster. And then we did also, with a lot of help from IT, finalize a SharePoint site, which is, now that I look at it, completely illegible on here, but it shows our work in progress, the individual assignments to individual staff, and then for each project we have it organized in project phases and are able to document our work without having to rely on Windows to not lose our versions. And we're working to do some workflow automations and similar things with IT. And that's the audit update.
Thank you. The state findings look quite well worked on and remediated. Some of those have sat out there for many, many years before this audit team was coalesced. And I know Mr. Ruff has been working on it and his team, and I appreciate your tracking it. I think that looks like it's getting into good shape. Furthermore, I mentioned this last time, but I sincerely want to thank you for all the things that you've done to not just help audit continue to run in a director's absence, but also to really work to make it better and to make it more robust and to put a lot of structure into your department. It's a small department, and I know it takes all of you, and thank all of you for continuing to work as a team. And I think that you've really kind of coalesced, and there's a really good culture going on right now in the internal audit department. So I appreciate your efforts and being good team players, and I especially, Mr. Vasiliev, appreciate all the work that you've done to help this, and I know that you've grown a lot through this time as well. So thank you. Any other comments from members of the committee? With that, I'd like to make this motion to receive and file an update on the internal audit department's works in progress. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Our meeting is concluded. Our agenda is exhausted and our meeting is concluded. Thank you.